try to be a lot more civilized than many of the parliaments we see around us. And with these few words, over to the Vice Chancellor.
The one thing which is essential to life is communication, and therefore debating, especially if you're in very strategic positions. I can see from the faces here, each of you is going to be a world leader in whatever capacity, in whatever profession. And you may not remain a debater for life, but debate will be your life. I don't know how to attract others. Why don't they see this? This man saw it from when he was in your shoes or earlier, and he continues to live with it. I continue to live with it, even if I formally don't spar. And I'm always happy to spar and lose to my students, one sitting here. So, I don't know what, but please do some brainstorming. And if next year's topic could be how to make this an epidemic, coming from a very biological standpoint, how could we make this an epidemic? I want everyone to be bitten by this bug. Why do I know the faces of my debaters? Why do I not know them? I mean, I want to have an amorphous mass over here who I really can't recognize because I've seen them in every debate. This is how I wish your endeavor success, your passion, our passion, it has to grow. I've had a lot of fun with the Calcutta Debating Society. He pulled me out kicking and screaming when I said, no, I'm very busy, I'm a Vice Chancellor. And he said, that's why, you have to do it. And it's been wonderful. I don't know, with presidency your relationship is permanent, but I don't know how long I'm active. But as long as I am, I'm really enjoying it. And I hope everyone who walks through these portals always enjoys it.
We have a unique gathering here today of colleges that we have invited, particularly because they represent the traditional mode of education in this city. They have a vast body of published research, especially institutions such as Jadavpur. And we also have some unique colleges which you have not met, our foreign visitors in particular. During the course of your visit, we have an engineering college here, we have a law college here, we have a medical college here. The tradition of debating in Kolkata, in our city earlier called Calcutta, is a very rich and diverse one. The reason why Calcutta Debating Circle got formed is because I was in this college and two of my hated rivals were across the street at the Calcutta Medical College. That's Dr. Kunal Sarkar and Sandeep Chatterjee. And they were my seniors by 2 years. So the first year was really bad because we got a drubbing. Second year we had sort of caught up. By the third year they ran away. I mean, they passed their exams, to be honest, and cleared medical college. So that's the tradition of debating. If any of you have read Professor Amartya Sen's book, The Argumentative Indian, that's not just a typecast, that's not a classification of an Indian, but among Indians, the people of Bengal have a longer and more intense tradition of arguing everything. And in a way that is why perhaps debating is so successful in the city. Now I'm very happy to welcome in our midst our various participants, and I'll just give you the name of our speaker so that you know each other. From Central Florida, Lakeland Taylor and Ariel Olson, could you stand up and be recognized? Thank you. Welcome to Presidency and welcome to this colloquium. From Cambridge University, Imran Matteo. So, your young friends at the back could see you. From Harvard, we have David Harmon and Paul Banks. Welcome to our gentlemen. From Oxford University, Richard Neo. Did I get that pronunciation correct? Close enough? Thank you. You represent two different continents, and we wish to hear how you perceive the future of the university system as it faces perhaps the rise or the fall of globalization and the rise of nationalism. From Jadavpur University, the Department of Engineering, Ananda Shankar Laha and Irene Banerjee, welcome. From the Calcutta University Department of Law College, Surya Sikha Ray and Advaita Maiti. Thank you. From Calcutta National Medical College, Shaunak Kundu, Tanmoy Majhi, and Deblina Pan. Thank you. From Bethune, Shamriti Chaudhary and Demanjana Bosu Chaudhary. Roy Chaudhary, I'm sorry, my mistake. And from Presidency, of course, Mayuri Mukherjee and Kushal Saha. And the final visiting team here today is Sri Shikshayatan College, represented by Sanchita Mathuria and Oindrila Das. Thank you, Sanchita. Thank you, Oindrila. The reason why we chose this theme was because over the last month or so, we've been receiving data from the various foreign consulates, and we find a surprising trend. A number of visa applications for US universities is falling. Fewer students are applying to study to the UK. A sharp fall in applications to Singapore. In contrast, a rise of applications to study in universities in China, a rise in applications to study in institutions in South Africa. So we were wondering, what exactly is happening? Why is it that the traditional destinations of Indian students and students overall, why is it shifting? Why is the world changing so rapidly? It was confusing for us because I work as a business editor and I found it confusing. I'm sure it's a lot more confusing for younger people. Where do you actually apply? Where do you go and study? And what happens after you get your degree? Where does the world lead you? I think jobs are scarce anywhere in the world. Perhaps they are more scarce in India, or perhaps they're less scarce, but it's like that. So, and people are crossing language barriers. For an Indian student to learn Chinese, to apply in a university in China or in Taiwan, is a very challenging proposition because that's a completely new system that he has to adapt to. And the other trend that we notice is that an increasingly large number of doctors and engineers and teachers from India are being employed in universities in Asia. Traditionally, Indian educators have traveled to the West. Now they travel to the East. This is something I think that concerns us all here. We have 3 continents represented here. We're very interested in hearing what you think about this problem. So, who is the brave volunteer who will go first? Can I start with Lakeland of Central Florida? Would you like to go first?
Yes, of course. So thank you for allowing us to be here. It's an immense honor for...
Would you like to stand up and face the audience?
Sure.
That would be, I think.
Thank you for letting us be here and exchange these ideas with all of you. I think I can speak for all of us just to say that this opportunity to exchange ideas is unparalleled to what a lot of college students are privy to, and so I thank you for that. When looking at trends in globalization, especially looking at the future of universities in light of globalization, I think that there are both positives and negatives to look at. And so I'm going to kind of briefly go over what I think are some positives in globalization and for universities, and some of the more negative aspects of it. So first, when we look at the positives of globalization, we can see that there's greater connectivity, I feel, happening in our world today, not just technologically, but economically. So we see an economic interdependence unparalleled to the past. And so as Greece's economy rises and falls, so does India's. So does the United States. So our economies are interdependent, and I think that's due in part to this idea of globalization and how we've become more connected to each other globally than ever before. I think also that we see a promotion of social goods. So as globalization increases, what I perceive as an increase in globalization, we are exposed to different ideas. We are exposed to different cultures. I mean, we would not be here in this room right now if not for globalization. We would not be here exchanging ideas if not for the importance that globalization places on exchanging ideas and entering into different perceptions and gaining a greater understanding of what it means to be human outside of just your own experiences. So now, to go into some of the perhaps more negative aspects of globalization, I feel that as globalization increases, you also have some problems with dominance, perhaps, where some cultures may outdo other cultures. They may go into a society and kind of overtake them, and so you see a perhaps loss of culture. So whereas globalization may be trying to increase our perception and our global awareness, it may also destroy some cultures and ruin the individualistic aspect of those societies and those cultures. We also see that sometimes when globalization increases, you tend to have this savior complex that happens, wherein larger superpower type of countries think that it is their responsibility to go into developing countries or smaller countries and fix them, help them, save them. And that can be a wrong way to think sometimes. But we see this complex arising in a globalized society. And so those are just some negatives that I perceive. And so with the future of universities, I think that what we see is that universities will become more diverse and complex, especially as we do exchange these ideas. I think that students will start to travel more, from my own experience coming from the United States, we don't place a heavy emphasis on learning a different language. And so that impedes students from going to countries that speak a different language than we do. And so, whereas I do think that colleges and universities will see an increase in diversity, perhaps not across the board, perhaps just solely within our respective language units or culture similarity units. And so those are just sort of the good and bad things that I think about when I think of this rise in globalization and how I perceive that for the future of universities, for sure.
Thank you, Lakely. We'll come back to some questions which some may have for you. We'll come back to that later. I would be failing in my duty if I did not recognize two eminent members from the University of Central Florida, Professor Richard Littlefield, who's sitting there, and Nick Sculio, who has a large fan following in Kolkata already because of two workshops he's conducted at the Heritage College and at the Future Foundation School, where I'm told he charmed the audience. Thank you, Nick. Well done. For the sake of achieving a balance between the international viewpoint and the international and the Indian perspective, may I tap Ananda Shankar Laha of Jadavpur University? Will you choose to come up to the dais and use the mic because our producers are getting very restless. They want somebody to use the lectern because they think it's photogenic. Over to you, Ananda.
Hi, I'm Ananda Shankar Laha from Jadavpur University, and today's topic reads Trends in Globalization and the Future of Universities. Now, I believe that globalization is an ancient word. It was conceptualized in the 1800s, and that was the time when the steam engine and imperialism were the major forces in the world. And globalization happened to create a passageway for transfer of goods, for transfer of power, for transfer of money across different borders of different countries. But now look at the face of globalization. Globalization today is different. Today's globalization is a new globalization that is characterized by the transfer of knowledge, and the internet facilitates it. While old globalization enabled transportation of goods across borders, the new globalization is different in the sense that it enhances communication of ideas across the globe. And hence, in this debate, we are concerned about the trends in globalization, because globalization has a changing face. And it is this changing face that we will discuss today. Now, this is an epic task to discuss the changing face of globalization, and I will try to fulfill it to the best of my ability. The most interesting aspect of globalization is, I believe, the way it is making our lives so fast-paced. And I personally feel that it is like walking on a constantly accelerating treadmill. And I don't know how fast it's going to be, how long I can sustain myself. Because every day our lives are becoming more and more fast. With the internet, every year we see that the transmission speeds of different devices, the storage capacities of different devices, they're doubling every year. And with new globalization, technology is international. European firms can now combine improved European technology with economical labor from different parts of the world. There is mass production of goods, and it's very fast. It's a win-win situation for both Asian, for both European countries. Some scholars have identified that globalization is of three types: economic, cultural, and political. Economic globalization has enabled billion-dollar industries to flourish at the expense of small-scale industries in a world that is ubiquitously capitalistic. There is also political globalization that has successfully created an international awareness about different human rights and the need to have conjoint effort to fight terrorism. Having said that, I would like to address the second part of the topic, which reads the future of universities, and I believe it's very connected to the first one, that is trends in globalization. Universities are also evolving. And it's not a rare scene nowadays to find that a lot of the lectures and the teaching sessions of the different universities are being video recorded. They are on YouTube. They are on NTPL, which is, in India, the lectures of different technological courses are on a particular website called NTPL, where students from other universities across India can refer to the lectures of eminent scholars and scientists in India and benefit from them. This is globalization, but although on a short scale. And also we are also aware of how MIT OCW has enabled better education for a lot of people across the world. Globalization has created an influx of information in our lives. But we also have to learn how to balance information and knowledge, because what is information may not always translate to knowledge. Sometimes we also get impatient for success. I believe this is a flaw of globalization. It makes us feel impatient all the time when we see people doing great things in such small spans of time. We must also understand that some people are more endured than us. So it's important to understand that globalization may create an impatience in youth, but it must be tackled in a very mature way. So technology is a powerful tool, and globalization has its demerits. And I believe that using technology, we can fight the demerits of technology as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ananda. Ananda's training to be an engineer, and his opening remarks reflected that training. Engineers never say that this is this, they always say, to the best of my ability and understanding, and from the testing results from the central testing laboratory, this bridge will not fall down. And then you build a bridge, and that's how it survives. Thank you, Ananda. We'll just cross the pond now, and I'll ask from Oxford, Richard Neo, how do you pronounce? I'm determined to get this right.
So I think the central question over the next century or so is probably how cheap can you make a really top quality education? Like what sort of limitations are there in theory? And I think there aren't actually that many limitations, right? So what are the problems? Well, there's there's the distribution of knowledge, right? And traditionally you need to build a university, you need to attract professors, you need to buy the ground and so on. You don't need that anymore. Like a competent software developer can put together a website that hosts, as much content as you want in a couple of weeks. That's not the limiting factor. There is content, that's a problem. Like getting really top-notch content is very expensive and very difficult. But fortunately, a lot of universities already have that. Because of the internet, you can scale that across hundreds of thousands or millions of people. So again, that's not going to be a limiting factor, even if it costs you millions of dollars to hire professors to create really great courses. If you get another million people taking those courses, it's going to be incredibly cheap. What else is there to education that we can't scale up because of the sort of globalized technological dividends? Well, there's a sort of practical aspects of it. So you have a sort of social environment in which you're learning from your peers. You have sort of life experiences throughout your time at university you can't really replicate just by taking online courses. So that's quite important. But at the same time, we're going to see breakthroughs in that as well, with particularly with virtual reality environments, which maybe in not now, but definitely in 30 or 40 years, it will be pretty common to interact with people online in a very similar way to how you interact with them face to face. Even if that doesn't happen, it's still a lot cheaper to bring students together and have them take courses online, for example, and they can have a social environment based in their home city, regardless of what course they're taking from what online university. So again, that shouldn't be a limiting factor. There's actually a startup in San Francisco which is trying to do this called Minerva University. So all the students live together in campus, in dorm buildings, but they have all their classes online with professors from across the world. So that's again, there's a lot of potential there, I think. So there are two more developments that I really want to talk about. The first one is the question of monopolies on academic content. So right now there's a massive problem when it comes to access to textbooks, when it comes to access to academic papers. There are big publishing houses like Elsevier, which basically take the work of academics, put it behind a paywall, and make it so expensive that even the librarian at Harvard, for example, has recently complained that even with their many billion dollars of endowment, they can't afford to keep buying all these articles that have been produced by academics for free, but then taken and locked away by these academic publishers. So I think we're going to see a movement to liberate that content, to have a lot more content available online. But then the second thing is the elephant in the room, as it were, the question of prestige and the question of credentials, right? Because you can put as much content as you want online, and that's not going to change the incentives for people to go to university, right? You've got the Harvard courses, many of them online in edX and Coursera, right? But that doesn't change the fact that you have the branding and the prestige of being one of the very few who's selected to go to a top university or one of the top universities in India and so on, right? So that's a fundamental problem, because giving people education is a positive-sum game. The more people you get educated, the better your society is. But making labeling some people as the top university graduates and some people as the bottom one, that's a zero-sum game. It just means that if you spend more money on tutoring, for example, to get into the top universities, then that's money that's wasted, because as long as people are getting similar education. So the question is, can we ensure that we move towards education that is more available, while also ensuring that people who get that sort of education aren't disadvantaged, aren't shut out from the traditional job markets, the traditional prestige of, for example, working as a academic researcher, simply because of the fact that they didn't attend a university with a more prestigious reputation, or they didn't pay more, or anything like that. And I think that's going to be the key issue over the next few years. Now, we've seen actually some progress on this. We've seen in technology companies, for example, I think at Google, somewhere between 10 and 20% of employees of software developers at Google don't actually have a university degree. That's because in technology, it's very easy to see, what your competence is. You can give somebody a few interviews, and you can really see, can they build these products? Do they know what they're doing? In a lot of subjects, in the humanities and so on, there's real knowledge there, but it's very difficult to test or to figure out for companies, is the person very competent? And so if we can have better better ways of evaluating that, then perhaps we're going to be able to break through the credentialing monopoly that sees in the UK, for example, a lot of people going to university even when they don't know what they want to study and they don't know where it's going to lead them, but they know that this is the only path forward. So that's my hope, that we can make progress on the front of education without necessarily making more progress on the front of the zero-sum games that mean that people are shut out from the benefits just because of the brand names and so on.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Globalization, globalized education came to India, to this very street 200 years ago, when two institutions were set up, this, the Hindu College, and the Calcutta Fever Hospital down the road. The Hindu College has evolved into presidency, celebrating 200 years. The Fever Hospital has become the Calcutta Medical College. It was only a lot later that the university, Calcutta University, was set up to supervise both. So when my young friend Ananda mentioned about globalization as an experience that happened 200 years ago for the Indian education framework, I think this was the past he was referring to. Two institutions separated just by a narrow lane starts off the introduction of globalized education in India, the Fever Hospital and the Hindu College. By the way, the Hindu College was did not indicate any ethnic identity. I think the word that was being shortened was the word Hindustan, the traditional name for the Mughal Empire in the books of the East India Company. Now, from engineer, we will move on to a generalist, and may I ask Samriti from Bethune College to please come up to the dais and tell us what she thinks about globalization and the future of universities. Bethune is once again one of the traditional colleges situated a little down this very road. This is for the benefit of our foreign visitors. Kolkatans need no introduction to Bethune. Yes, over to you, sir.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here from Bethune College, and here it goes. Globalization is defined as organizations, be it any organizations, they're going on an international level. It refers to compression of the world as a whole and intensification of the world as a whole. It is a powerful idea that affects all aspects, be it economics, be it politics, be it education. In the field of education, globalization has touched and influenced many aspects like internationalization, distance learning, new form of citizenship, and commodification. Now coming to the first part of the topic, trends in globalization. In a world where campaign slogans like Make America Great Again or Give Us Our Country Back of the Trump and Brexit campaigns respectively, gaining the massive popularity it did, it clearly highlights the situation of reversal of international economic integration, aka deglobalization. America, which all its life had been a chief proponent of globalization or free trade, talks differently today. Trump, apparently he's hated. People are not very fond of Trump throughout the world and apparently throughout America. But yet the fact that Trump is in the position that he is in today is because of the fact that he got the votes of all the unskilled workers, people who were the losers of globalization, people who were against the NAFTA trade deals, people who were against immigrants coming and taking over their jobs, against China coming and taking over their profits. On Brexit happened on a similar note. People were threatened by the fact that immigrants, foreign people were coming and taking over their job market. So Trump, Brexit, and the rise of right-wing politics in various corners of the world tells us that deglobalization is indeed a reality today. Now coming to the second part of the topic, future of universities. In a post-Brexit UK, EU students are subject to complex and expensive visa requirements like other foreign students. They are no longer eligible for loans from the student loan company. Some students both from EU and even from abroad come to UK to study and settle down there, obviously. But there's questionable freedom in such possibilities for not only the foreign students, but for those students belonging to EU itself. Now, apart from that, from the period of 2006 to 2009, we had witnessed American universities opening global branches. Qatar had seen an all-star list. There were universities like Cornell, Georgetown coming to Qatar and opening their global branches. There was this university called Troy. This is a public university in Alabama that opened like 14 global branches all over the world. The chief motive of these universities going global was to gain profits and to create a global brand name. But today, these universities are lacking funds. They have failed to attract students coming to them, and they have failed to create a sustainable, viable business model and are soon dying out. Now coming to Trump's immigration policies. he has set a ban on the 7 Muslim majority states. And this has obviously affected the 1 million foreign students who are presently studying in America and will continue to further affect these students and also the academic circles of America. Now, how the developing nations and India, for the fact, view this trend in deglobalization is something that it is too early to talk about that. But it is clearly evident that the students are not choosing destinations like UK and America as their educational pilgrimage. They're not going there simply because of the fact that there are more stringent rules, more expensive rules for them while they're in college, and even after they get out of college and start working there, the situation is not very congenial for them. So I would like to conclude in the fact that globalization is a mere concept, lofty and impeccable in theory, but not so great in practice, as we clearly see from the present situation. But what I believe, a heady mix of both globalization and deglobalization is the best way forward, be it in education or be it in any other sphere. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamriti. I think pretty balanced view of globalization from one of the oldest colleges. No, you can take your seat, and may I now request a budding lawyer, Shuryoshika, will you come up? And law is one of the most deglobalized of sectors in education. Most countries have silos, and they do not allow people, an individual holding a legal degree to practice across geographies. So we have a situation where despite a history of over a century of Indians going overseas and studying law in the UK, you have to come back here and qualify through an exam. And it's the other way around. And it's one of the more common trends in India today for young Indian lawyers passing out through various colleges to go and obtain registration in other bars so that they can practice overseas. So in this most fractured of disciplines, we have a spokesperson from that sector, Shuryoshika from the Calcutta University Department of Law.
Good morning, everyone. So unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, people around the world often misunderstand globalization to be something which is related only to terms and concepts of markets. We need to realize that globalization is a driving force which can be utilized to further advance the betterment of mankind. And in this, educational institutions in general, or universities to be specific in this particular discussion, have a very major role to play. So when we discuss the future of universities, the ways in which universities around the world respond to globalization and what the concerned governments do should be a defining issue. We need to understand that the global trends in the sphere of education today is not just about massification and improvements in communication and information technology and people moving from one part of the world to another and sharing knowledge over the World Wide Web. Because you need to understand that the people who are actually engaged in such activities represent the different privileged sections of the society from around the world. We do not have adequate social inclusion or representation of people from different backgrounds, ladies and gentlemen, which is an enormous challenge that higher education is facing today. There is an uneven distribution of human capital and funds, and according to UNESCO, this is something which can be utilized by different universities and different countries from, the developed nations to make full use of their opportunities, and at the very same time, the least developed countries and the developing countries will be drifting further and further behind. We need to understand that expansion in the sphere of education has not solved certain persistent social inequalities. From around the world, students from minority communities, rural areas, older students, and students from disabled or people with disabilities are still underrepresented, and they do not get the opportunities to come up to the threshold of higher education and contribute to the global economy, although they might have the potential to do so. We need to understand that, on the other hand, we have issues of mass enrollment in universities around the world. It also creates needs for diversified systems, hierarchies of institutions serving different needs and constituencies, and as a result, in future, the private sector will continue to expand as it has already started doing right now. Because public institutions at a certain point of time will not be able to keep up to the student demands, and privatization will take place when education will again be more accessible to the elite and the semi-elite communities. For the private institutions, profit making will be a priority, and that is undoubtedly important. But at the very same time, they have to take care that certain standards of education are maintained and service to the society is ensured. Today, ladies and gentlemen, neoliberal attitudes, limited public funding, increasing costs, and needs to meet the different international standards will actually oblige public institutions to increase their income by approaching different sources like research, consulting, and university industry partnerships. So once again, this will be a challenge where cost will be a barrier for many people in the sphere of higher education. Impacts of information and communication technology has been massive. Today we can, share knowledge over the World Wide Web, publish journals and books on electronic media. But unfortunately, even this is not accessible to many around the world, especially with people with limited resources in the developing nations who still do not have the infrastructure and equipment for higher learning. Also, quality assurance continues to be a high priority. The trend that is driven by international mobilization of students and scholars is actually towards internationally referenced standards and social expectations. But at the very same time, governments should put a major thrust on developing mechanisms to certify and integrate national quality assurance schemes on an international level. Because countries with due course of time will be challenged to balance their local needs and priorities with standards, practices, and expectations attributed at an international level. So, as globalization takes place, what universities can do on their part is to modify their curriculum in a way so that theoretical and practical learning get equal importance, so that students are trained to make better application of whatever they learn for the betterment of the society and for the upliftment of the global economy. And at the very same time, they have to be respectful and dutiful towards their local and defining communities. Because, ladies and gentlemen, until and unless complete inclusion of people take place, and until and unless quality gets a priority over quantity in the sphere of higher education, the final goal of globalization, that is full and integral human development of people, will not take place. Thank you.
Thank you, Shashika. I am moving on to Harvard, and may I request David to make his comments on how he sees globalization and the future of industry, of universities.
Hey everyone. So a few people today have talked about the history of globalization, and then several people have talked about globalization as promoting a lot of changes in the world today. One interpretation of the topic treats globalization as a new phenomenon, tries to explain the role that education should play and how education should cope with the changes. Today, however, we're almost 30 years into the era marked by the fall of communism, the entry of the fast-growing Asian economies like India into the global trade regime, and the liberalization of labor's ability to move somewhat freely around the world. This kind of globalization, the current era, is not so much a new concept as something that is firmly entrenched in the world today and has brought numerous benefits along with detrimental consequences, and it's something that we have to cope with as threats to globalization start to emerge. Some of the unquestionable benefits of this shift include the complete erasure of major interstate war, the decrease in extreme poverty around the world, including right here in India. For the first time, people care more about things like heart disease than the rate of infant mortality. The fields of science, technology, and medicine have reached previously unfathomable heights due to the cross-border exchange of knowledge and skills. For example, we find new solutions to antibiotic resistance in the old Soviet technologies of using bacteriophages. We use Chinese spacecraft to get to the International Space Station and promote cooperation. All of this progress now, though, looks increasingly fragile. I would separate globalization into two distinct phases. The first was one that could be characterized by something approximating Pareto optimality as an economic concept. Everyone essentially became better off in a net sense, although there were negative consequences that went along with it. Now, however, we're in a second era where the former winners and proponents of globalization, the developed countries of the West, are starting to take the position of the losers of further globalization, whereas countries like India, China, Korea, the Southeast Asian emerging economies are the new winners. Over the last 10 years, we've seen the share of economic growth and economic activity that takes place in the emerging world increase massively, and the share of economic activity that takes place in the developed world decrease. What we're learning today is that globalization is not just the inevitable result of technology and progress, but is a process that has to be actively defended by people around the world. And the former defenders of globalization are now taking a step back. As several other speakers have mentioned, things like Brexit and Trump illustrate that increasing inequality decreasing inequality across borders and increasing inequality within borders are emboldening nationalist, populist movements that are fighting back against the continued progress of globalization and require new people to essentially take up the mantle of globalization and argue against them. Who are these new defenders? They're the people my age, all of you all, in countries like India, China, Southeast Asia, and increasingly Africa. The privilege that was accorded to the developed Western nations by the first phase of globalization will not be relinquished voluntarily. In some ways, it must be taken. And that is sort of what I want to talk about with respect to the role of the university today. If you go to US universities, there's been a ton of criticism throughout the last 20 years related to the role of neoliberal education and the promotion of traditional economic ideologies. And although it's true that that has in some ways shut down criticism, what it's also done is create a class of academics who have been extremely powerful defenders of things like free trade, like the entry of developing economies into the global trade regime, like the breakdown of protectionist measures that have brought a bunch of benefits. The thing I want to propose, somewhat controversially, is that in non-Western universities, a lot of much more time and much more energy has been devoted to the critics of globalization, which has been incredibly necessary up until this point, but may become less necessary moving forward. And some of the forms of neoliberal education that we formerly spent most of our time criticizing may actually be valuable as something that we can import or export around the world in order to create a more balanced debate moving forward. The thing I want to propose is that in order to keep institutions like the UN, the IMF, the WTO functioning properly, the new technocrats, the new defenders of the economic policies that underpin globalization need to come from new places, and those new places can be universities like this, they can be universities in China, and the thing that I want to caution against is allowing the reaction to things like Trump saying no more immigration to the US and cracking down on visas, allowing the reaction to that to be a total withdrawal from the international economic order. The other thing I want to talk about is the role of universities, and particularly debate in universities, of hedging back against nationalist populist movements like the ones that have characterized Trump and Brexit. Things like cross-border exchanges and interaction between students across in different countries are essential to promote a sense of our common humanity and break down dangerous ideologies. There are examples in the Israel-Palestine conflict, and then the question I want to ask is why not also export that model to things like relations between India and China, or India and Pakistan, or the US and China? We're seeing a little bit of it with cross-border scholarships like the Schwartzman program and with things like what the Calcutta Debating Circle is doing, but we could clearly see more. The other thing is that debate teaches the necessary critical thinking skills that we need in order to resist the propagation of misinformation and false claims around the world. When the Western critics of globalization get up and say, give us back our jobs, we need to defend our national identity, we need people who are able to critically interrogate those claims and think about the logical gaps in them in order to make the argument at a global scale that will ultimately defeat them. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts on globalization. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was lovely, and I think I cannot but mention one point he made, that the new defenders of globalization possibly have to come from new places, because the original architects are now stepping back, and this is something that I think would be quite new to Indian audiences. He also mentioned about exchange with Pakistan, and I was going to make this speech anyway. This is the first time in 3 years that Calcutta Debating Circle has not had student debaters from Pakistan. We understood that some sort of problem was happening because, among others, I got an invitation to go and debate in Pakistan, and this was in February of this year, and there was no visa forthcoming. As the year progressed and we lined up universities in Pakistan for their students to come over, it became very clear that debaters in particular were not encouraged to travel across borders. I guess they allow all sorts of other people to travel, but not debaters, irrespective of what discipline you belong to. And that's a tragedy, because we've enjoyed our debating against and with our fellow students and faculty members from Pakistan year after year. And it's a tragedy that we couldn't do it this year. Next year, perhaps, things will take a turn for the better, and we will be in a position to host them. Some of the senior presidency students here would remember the visitors we had last year and the year before last. So I guess the way to overcome this is, cross-border scholarship, more open people exchange, and stuff like that. From Sri Shikshayatan College, another respected institution, may I request Aindrila to set the ball rolling, and if you could come here. We have Sri Shikshayatan, although it's located in the heart of the city, is an old institution which has been, how many, your college is what, 60 years old? 65 years of service to education in the city, college affiliated under Calcutta University. So, over to you.
Very good morning to one and all present here. Our esteemed Mr. Pradeep Gupta, who happens to be the trustee of Calcutta Debating Circle, our distinguished guests from the West, my worthy opponents from the city and this august house. Well, for an introduction, this is Ondrila Das from Sri Shikshayatan College, but well, let's keep the small talk aside since there's paucity of time. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you're expecting me to go by a dictionary definition of the word globalization, I think I may disappoint you here, because I couldn't make up my mind to go by the Oxford Dictionary or the Cambridge Dictionary without hurting the sentiments of the students here who have come from both such prestigious universities. Well, therefore, I would like to borrow Shashi Tharoor, who happens to be a parliamentarian, and he had used this in his Harvard keynote speech. He said that, well, over a decade ago, the headlines were filled with Princess Diana's death, and they reeked of globalization. Now, how is that so, you might ask? Well, ladies and gentlemen, an English princess with a Welsh title leaves a French hotel with an Egyptian companion who has supplanted a Pakistani. She then gets into a German car with a Dutch engine driven by a Belgian chauffeur full of Scottish whiskey. They are then chased by an Italian paparazzi in Japanese scooters and motorbikes into a Swiss-built tunnel where they crash. A rescue is briefly attempted by American doctors using Brazilian medicine, and this whole story is told to you as an analogy by me, a mere 19-year-old undergrad, from this podium within the four walls of Presidency University Hall in Calcutta. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is globalization. Therefore, Globalization, what do we learn from this? What do we deduce from this? Globalization is the increasing interaction of people, states and nations through the exchange of ideas, thoughts, money, culture, descent. Globalization is also a process of integration of the social and the cultural aspects. IMF, for that matter, has described or categorized 4 aspects of globalization. The first being trade and transaction, the second being capital and investment, the third being migration and immigration, the fourth being dissemination of knowledge. But ladies and gentlemen, in academic literature, we subcategorize globalization into 3 divisions. The first being economic globalization, which we quite know very well. The second being political globalization, and the third being cultural globalization. But ladies and gentlemen, there is a separate form of globalization which I'd like to term as the intellectual globalization. Ladies and gentlemen, what I feel, once we have been absolutely globalized, once we are in the post-globalized era, there will be a need of intellectual globalization. Having said that, ladies and gentlemen, intellectual globalization, in my opinion, is something more pristine, more profound, more sacred, and is necessary for the emancipation of mind. Now, let's not digress into this division, this different aspect of globalization which I've put forward. Let's talk about the thing at hand, that is the trends in globalization and the future of universities. Well, ladies and gentlemen, what we have seen lately is that globalization bridges the gap. Precisely why we in India can, by the usage of massive open online course, which happens to be MOOCs, MOOCs for that matter, can get credits from such esteemed universities as Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, and the like. It is MOOCs that has bridged the gap. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, what I believe is that globalization acts as an advantage. It gives the Indian universities to strive forward, because globalization has provided competition. It has provided stiff competition to the Indian universities. In an era where procrastination is the new cool, I believe even Indian universities are suffering from procrastination, because just so you know, the education system in India is absolutely devastating. Therefore, I feel it is globalization that is going to push the Indian education system forward. Moving on, ladies and gentlemen, I believe globalization is not just the cause to have improved standards of education, but is also the effect of improved standards of education. What we must understand is that globalization later in life, now that we are already in the process of globalization and we are going to hit the post-globalization era, we soon will be facing, we soon will need higher standards of living, and higher standards of living demand higher standards of employment. Higher standards of employment de facto calls for improved quality of education. Thus, in a way, I believe I support this topic, that is the trends in globalization does have a positive impact on the future of universities. Ladies and gentlemen, a lot of questions has been posed today. Today, the young lad from Harvard probably said that the question of the hour is how to make education cheap. But ladies and gentlemen, I believe the question of the hour is not to make education cheap, but to make education available. These are unprecedented times, ladies and gentlemen. These are times when we have someone, a misogynist masquerading as the Commander-in-Chief for the United States of America. These are unprecedented times when we have the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland facing possibly an economic meltdown post-Brexit. These are unprecedented times when we see Syria and Iraq as the war-ravaged nation. These are unprecedented times when we see the African Union in an absolute state of chaos. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the question of the hour is not to make education cheap, but education available to that brother in Aleppo who has probably lost both his parents, to that Muslim women in India who possibly does not know that triple talaq has been ruled out, to that Muslim brother who has an amputated arm because of the Israel-Palestine issue. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the question of the hour is how to make education available. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I rest my case. Are there any questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. We will go with the host institution now. From Presidency, Kushal Shaha.
Good morning, thank you for being here. Living as we do in the age of globalization, we've steadily seen it affecting every walk of our lives. We've also seen its impact spilling over to higher education in the recent past. In fact, over the past few decades, we have seen it being manifested in the form of higher number of international students, greater collaboration in research, and also in the continuous convergence of government policies. This has been facilitated by, among other things, falling transport costs, greater collaboration among international journals, and this in turn has particularly affected research. I am of course talking here about the past few decades. How has it affected research? One of the greatest things that this has managed to do is that collaboration among researchers across the world has happened, and it has led to global outlooks for local issues and local outlooks for global issues in a way that was not previously seen or was not even previously thought to be possible. It has also spilled over, among other things, to teaching. We see it particularly in presidency. We see the number of lecturers I've had who have come from abroad have taught me in my department, that's economics, over the last few years has been unprecedented, and it's not something that I expected to see in school at any point of time. But as Mr. Guptu pointed out at the very beginning, things are changing, and that's what we are here to address today. Why do we see the change in the trends that we are seeing today? Why is it that, as Mr. Guptu says, the traditional centers of education like the US, the UK, why are the number of students going there falling? And I would say that these things have a lot to do with very recent developments in technology. Perhaps one of the most important factors in this respect is something that a number of others have already pointed out. I am of course talking about the surging of online education forums. Khan Academy, Coursera, courses like these have opened up a plethora of knowledge that was previously thought to be inaccessible by anyone in this world. All but maybe a few of the most well-funded universities in the world could expect to have such diversity in coursework as has been shown to be possible by these institutions, right? And at the same time, there's also the question of credibility. Credibility as a problem has always plagued online forums. The reason for this being that, well, for all the knowledge that you can get, for all the certificates you can get out of these online forums, you just don't get to monetize that in terms of jobs or research, right? Because most people just don't recognize that. As a former vice chancellor of the University of California at Berkeley said, the people who have the most to gain from these online forums is the private companies themselves, because they are the ones who have to invest the least in these forums but are getting the maximum out of this. And this leads me to yet another one of my points, which is the soaring cost of education worldwide. Unfortunate as it may be, even as government budgets today feel the pinch, we see that education and healthcare are often the first items on the chopping block. And that is something that, while we see as unfortunate, it also seems to be unavoidable. And this has opened up the need for different kinds of partnerships worldwide that need to finance education of the future. There's also the issues related, of course, to the current trends in globalization, particularly Brexit, the election of Donald Trump all over in the US. And with that, the rising constriction in visa rules and things like that. All of these have considerably changed the trends that we see today in global education, and that is why we need to have systems that are different from what we saw in the last few decades, and that is actually why you are seeing these different trends that Mr. Guptu pointed out in the first place. Thank you, I rest my case.
Thank you. Thank you, Kushal. To brief you on the health of the House, may I request a young medical student, Yatanmoy. No, Shonda. So Shaunak from the Calcutta National Medical College, one of the oldest medical colleges in this part of the world.
Understand that globalization is a non-tangible and non-physical process that essentially lacks checks and balances, right? So what do I mean by that? So before I go into that, understand that globalization is not essentially a modern phenomenon, right? It has existed ever since colonial times. So understand how foreign-driven globalization essentially foreign-driven invasion essentially helped in the spread of globalization, right? Understand that when a powerful nation goes on to invade and take over a subject nation, it essentially aims to thrust its own cultural and structural identities on the new subject nation, right? What does it mean? Understand that while a nation is essentially a human construct, understand that what essentially goes into making a nation are the national identities which differ from one nation to another, right? So when a parent nation goes on and subjugates a new nation, what it essentially does is want to convert the new citizens into citizens of its parent nation, right? So when there is a Great Britain-driven invasion of India, it wants to convert Indians into Britishers, right? So understand that what goes into defining a Britisher will essentially be different and will clash with the traditions and practices of what makes a person essentially Indian, right? So what happens as a result of that is the first harm of globalization, which I personally like to call cultural anti-appropriation, right? Which is the abolition of a minority culture by a more majority culture, right? This is where the idea of the lack of checks and balances of globalization essentially comes in, right? What does it mean? Understand that while Western invasions of Eastern nations have removed more regressive and traditional practices, it has also removed more definitive aspects, right? Which brings me to the idea of historical education in India, right? The idea of the Gurukul system or brilliant ancient Indian universities like Nalanda and Takshila, which have actually regressed because of foreign invasion, right? And not just this, another good example is the Spanish conquest of the Americas, right? Which essentially slaughtered the Mayans and obliterated their culture, right? So why am I bringing in a 500-year-old idea into a more modern context of globalization? Understand that this harm of globalization, the cultural anti-appropriation, isn't restricted to colonial times, right? It happens even with the use of modern mass media, right? How? The best example is mass-scale Americanization that occurs to nations all across the world currently, right? Which essentially erodes the national identities that I, as a member of a particular nation, will essentially be proud of, right? Now, talking about trends in globalization, right? So, what are more modern trends in globalization? The most evident one, naturally, is what has been previously mentioned by most speakers, is the recourse of Western liberal democracies to more orthodox right-wing ideas, right? So understand what is the human nature of the local populace in these nations, right? So they view immigration as a national defiler, right? Where your average immigrant is now seen as a threat who steals your jobs and sometimes is even stereotyped as a radicalizer, right? So what happens is you're alienating these new immigrants who come to your country seeking an education or seeking a job, right? And there are even instances of violence, right? So what essentially happens due to this, right? People from these Eastern nations who traditionally went to the West seeking a better education will no more do so fearing for their own lives, right? As Sir had previously mentioned, there is a drop in visa rates for applying to Western universities, right? As with respect to countries like China or more newer nations like Taiwan, right? So understand the harms in this case are twofold, right? First of all, the harms to the accepted university in the West, right? Understand that a university is supposed to be a boiling pot of heterogeneity, right? It's supposed to there's supposed to be an exchange and flourish of cultural exchange and debate and discourse, right? Which essentially does not take place anymore because there is no influx of people from different cultures from the East, right? There is also harm to nations which essentially sent its citizens to get educated abroad, right? Understand that a nation that lacks the educational infrastructure of a Western nation dependent on its citizens to actually go abroad, learn new things and then come back and propel the nation forward, right? Which essentially does not happen anymore, right? Now the second trend in globalization, which is the idea of forced capitalism that globalization actually brings with itself, right? What does that cause with respect to education, right? Understand that there is upliftment of education cost and privatization, right? What does this lead to essentially? Privatization leads to increasing costs and unaffordability, right? Which I, as an aspiring medical student, can attest to, right? Understand that government seats in medical colleges in India are really restricted, right? And I was lucky to be in one. If I didn't crack the exam that got me into a government university, I would have to study by a private university, which would make me sell my kidneys, right? So understand that income backgrounds now determine the education one receives, right? So talent is now essentially sidelined, and people of wealthier heritage will now have control over education structures, right? So what harm does this eventually lead to? Understand that there is a degradation in the quality of students that enter into these private universities, right? And there is a lack of healthy competition among students, right? So it's just your wealth that's determining whether you get into a university or not, and not your brain or your talent, right? So understand that as a result, what happens is the standard and status of higher education itself is decreasing, and it becomes unappealing and unaffordable for the masses, right? So what is the second harm of this, right? Understand that privatization essentially shuts down education opportunities to the poor, which means that there is no mitigation of poverty, right? In developing countries, education is essentially a pathway to bring you out of poverty, right? Which is essentially shut off, and as a result, what happens is the poor continue to remain poor, right? What does this eventually lead to? This leads to creation of strict social classes having lack of social mobility, right? Which is essentially something similar to the caste system, which is a social evil that has existed in the social structure of India, and that we want to essentially mitigate, right? So essentially globalization is leading to the coming back of these regressive social structures that we essentially want to mitigate, right? So hence, as you can see, current trends in globalization are essentially harming the future of universities and even the countries that harbor these universities, right? Thank you.
Thank you, Shaunak. That was a very impassioned take on the motion that we have here today. And may I request Imran Matthew from the University of Cambridge to give us his viewpoint on the trends in globalization and the future of universities.
Hi, good morning everyone. So I think a lot has been said already about how the improvement in technology and the transfers that it results in necessarily means that there's more access towards online courses. And I'll also talk a little bit about that, but I also think it's important to recognize that in many ways the ability of individuals to move and the mobility that individuals have faced as a result of globalization also has lots of positive impacts. We look at universities and the way in which that translates to how they're able to learn more things. So I think if we look in general at how visas have developed over the last few years, and if you look at India as an example as well, where you have an online visa now to come over, I think the systems in which individuals can access visas and the ways in which their access have become much better. So that means if students want to go to different countries to pursue higher education, that's become much more of a possibility, and it's become a much more informed possibility because you've got more information about how you get these visas and also like what are the steps towards taking them. I think also if you look at it in terms of how universities now link into countries that are nearby them and the ways in which individuals are able to learn more about the countries that surround them, but also in a vocational sense in terms of the job opportunities they can get. If you look, for example, like the ASEAN programs in which individuals are now able to get internships within the ASEAN regions and go to different countries and experience different systems. So even if that's perhaps in the technology sector, perhaps in law, perhaps in business, you're able to have a much more globalized sense of the region in which you're operating in and the way in which they conduct business there, or perhaps a particular profession in which you are looking to aim for. I think also if you look at summer schools, for example, like lots of universities now start running summer programs. And I think this sort of links to what Richard was talking about earlier when Richard said that oftentimes we can't perfectly replicate the experience you get traditionally at a university online because it's hard to get that kind of interaction. I think if you look at these things like summer schools and if you look at programs that run in person, it also is an opportunity for people to go and speak to one another and to be able to get the kind of feedback that you possibly don't get online. So while you have online platforms and you probably have like forums where you're able to exchange ideas and you're able to have discussions, it's very different from the kind of feedback that you traditionally get at university where you have someone look at the work you produce and talk to you about that work and perhaps have some sort of feedback on that. And I think it's quite a different experience, but it's also an experience that globalization brings to us. I think also, and this is building partially on what David was talking about in terms of master's programs and the scholarships that you get. I think that also links slightly to what the chair was talking about earlier in terms of looking at how individuals now are also looking at other countries to pursue degrees. So China, for example, now provides scholarships to some individuals who'd like to pursue programs, particularly master's programs. And I think to a very good extent that explains the benefits of globalization in showing how individuals now can get another perspective to certain things that they might have studied in an undergraduate degree and see different ways in which it's either thought or different perspectives on an academic subject which they had at an undergraduate degree. And linking that into the transfer of knowledge and why that's become easier, and perhaps also why that means individuals now are looking at a broader range of countries, right? So I think in the past it was a lot harder for us to look at materials, primary or secondary, that were in different languages. It was a lot harder for it to be translated, there was a lot less of a demand for it, and even if it was translated, it probably wasn't shared in an ideal manner for a high number of individuals to access it. But I think with the improvement of the internet system and with the improvement of the ways in which content is distributed, it also means that there is a greater market for translations and there's a greater opportunity for translations of materials to be shared. And I think you see this even in law, and I think the chair mentioned earlier that law is perhaps one of the subjects which usually operates in its own pockets and doesn't really spread throughout countries, and you don't really see many perspectives. But I think we see that to a greater extent now with globalization even. So for example, if you look at the study of comparative law, you probably now are able to access materials in other languages that have been translated, and you can compare that to the law in your own country and in your own systems. And I think that's something that wouldn't have happened without globalization because A, we probably wouldn't have had the ease of transferring that material, but B, also we probably wouldn't have had the demand for that material and the ability to transfer it. And I think it's just become so much easier now because when you look at the way in which the demand is structured, you can easily look at what needs to be translated and how that can be transferred as a result using the internet. And I think when you also look at campuses abroad and how universities have started pushing forward syllabuses that they've developed within their own countries to other countries, I think to a good extent that's probably an area which still needs developing. It's not an ideal model yet because obviously you'd still want to consider the benefits and the cons of it, but I think at the same time it's an emerging area in which universities are considering and seeing what are the ways in which we can push forward our syllabus, what are the ways in which we can transfer that knowledge. And whenever something starts out, you'll always have problems in the beginning, but I think it's an area which can be explored to a very, very great extent. And moving on to some other benefits of the internet, and I think globalization has greatly fostered this. If you look at the way in which content producers now can transfer that information, if you look at the way in which they can disseminate that information, a lot of it has improved due to globalization, because when there's a recognition that the content is very useful and that it can be transferred, that's when you start having regulations that try to promote that have ways in which you can transfer your material through like different publishing houses, through different online sales. And while that does remain expensive to a good extent, as Richard mentioned currently, I think in the long run that's something that will develop. It's something in which people recognize there needs to be a greater transfer of material. And perhaps the way in which that happens is that material first gets transferred to a much larger state library and then people can go there and access it. But at the very least, it's a step forward from not having that material and from not being able to access that material. So it still remains expensive and probably isn't very easy to transfer in some ways, but it does mean that you at the very least get some sort of transfer if perhaps it goes to state libraries first, people can go and access that, and perhaps over time it becomes much cheaper when you have more materials online. The cost overall can come down because these companies purely would want to increase their profits by trying to sell more at a lower cost. And it's obviously something that still is developing in many different ways, but I think globalization does have a lot of positive impacts for the future of universities, and it's something that we should look forward to. Thank you.
Thank you. That was lovely. So here I am, writing with a pen with a Chinese roller made out of Japanese steel into an Indian notepad made using Malaysian pulp, embossed with Japanese ink, stuck together with Chinese glue, and they tell me globalization is dead. I don't think we are deglobalizing in any way at all. We've done the first round of all the institutions present here, and I thank all the 10 institutions for for sending representatives to speak their mind at this parliament. We now go into the second round where we'll, I'm sure, have more nuanced expressions of opinion. And may I call upon, again, our young lawyer, Adwaita, to, we are running a little behind time, so if you could manage to keep it as brief as possible. Thank you.
Okay, so in the first round, it has been very well characterized what globalization is. But from the 10 different speeches that we saw today, what I understood is there can be no consensus about what globalization will ultimately mean for how universities will educate their students, how they will interact with the peers or collaborate with government or private partners and define the fundamental goal. So what we need to realize is we need to figure out on what are the factors on which the progress of future universities will depend. Like the factors on which the progress of universities will depend, and that will characterize their nature in future. So in order to figure that out, we first need to understand that it depends a lot on the formation of new global alliance of academic institutes all across the world in various nations and the collaborations that occur. And it also depends on development of new ways to translate discoveries, the discoveries that happen in different institutions, and translate them into goods and services. It also depends on the capability to educate, train, and form a new generation of global leaders of who will characterize this movement, and finally it depends on the intellectual collaboration on a new scale. So actually when I came over here, I had no idea on what I need to speak, so I asked sir that, sir, what do I speak on? So sir said, you just say what is a lawyer's take on the problem. So coming to that, what I can say is, if we consider the globalized form of legal education, if we analyze it from the legal perspective, then there's a positive point and a negative point. Like the positive point over here is law is characterized by the concept of justice, and no matter from which country we belong, no matter from which socio-economic background we belong, we all have a common idea of justice. So that common idea of justice can bring all law students, all individuals who are pursuing this stream to come together in future and work together and maybe form the global university of the global village that globalization talks about. And what is the negative aspect? The negative aspect is there will be interconflicting ideas of law in various countries. Let us take the example of Europe. The country of Great Britain and Northern Ireland talks about the concept of common law, whereas the other European nations talk about civil law. Both of these address the same issues, but they address it in a different manner. So when collaborations like this happen in future, there will be an interconflicting idea. So the key of existence of universities in future in context of globalization will probably be coexistence and progress and exchange of ideas and not consensus, because we saw already in the first round that we could not attain a consensus regarding what the idea of globalization is. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Advaita. Can I call Sanchita from Sri Shikshayatan College? Sanchita, will you come up and tell us what you think of where the universities are heading in the light of the changes in globalization that we see? Sanchita. Again, I have to warn you, we are a little behind time, so keep it as brief as possible.
So I think in the first round, everyone has given a very good description and the characteristics of globalization. Thinking about us youngsters today, for me, globalization personally is being in India and being able to go to Hard Rock Cafe and enjoying a McDonald's burger. That is globalization for me. When I think of the US, I think of Trump and I think of friends. Yes, educational institutions are there. I'll admit to that. But I won't see them. Why? Because I am a middle class person and my family's annual income will not be able to suffice for the fees. Those expenses are not feasible for us. When I think of Britain, I think of Doctor Who. I think of Benedict Cumberbatch, and that's where I stop. I can't go on any further. And yes, I do keep myself informed with the politics of the time. Globalization is simply the fact that there is going to be a Trump Towers coming up in Kolkata. That is globalization for me. for Kolkata, I'd say. The simple fact that we have brands from all over the world here and we have companies from all over the world. That is globalization. And there are merits and obviously demerits of globalization for both developed and developing countries. In developing countries, we have exploitation of labor, while on the other hand, in developed countries, the workers face problems because the employers demand pay cuts. If they refuse to do so, they'll simply export the jobs to other countries. So I think that is a big problem. And obviously, if I go to a foreign university, I have to look after my economic means. That's one thing. But when we see hate crimes as Indian students, when we see hate crimes being committed in certain countries, it kind of puts us down to the simple fact that we might not be as accepted there. That is one of the main things that globalization should solve, really. If we tend to make this world a global village, there has got to be an acceptance of people. When I think, and the major flaw of globalization is that it gives a very flawed perspective of a country. When I think of Africa, I think of the poor orphans. I don't think about the wonderful wildlife, the flora and the fauna that they have there. And I think as you all, when you think about India, if you have seen Slumdog Millionaire, you think about poverty. And that is a very true fact. Entertainment, media, they too make us bias our opinions. But the fact is that when it comes to education, globalization plays an important role. Web forums, internet has really helped us. I think 20, 30 years ago, you wouldn't be here, I wouldn't be here. We are here today. So yes, that is certainly a very good merit of globalization. But when it comes to education, we see that most universities in developed countries, they are trying to attract more foreign students. Now, why is that? That is simply because it is an economic gain for those countries, definitely. It kind of puts a pressure on our pockets. But then again, globalization. I just like to point it out here that globalization is a very gray area for all of us. It's not all good, it's not all bad, it's somewhere in between. Some of its aspects are so good that we are just in love with it. We get to see different cultures, different opinions, different peoples. We get to know their minds. And I am on Tumblr, so I was recently talking to a girl who's from Africa. So yes, that's a very good globalization. But then again, there are certain fears of typecasting countries into a certain point. When you see at certain countries, you just see the problems that they have. Once you visit them, you really realize the natural beauty and the progress they've made, which might not be as properly showed in the media platforms. I think when it comes to education, globalization has a huge role to play. It has its demerits, it has. But there are merits. There are merits in the fact that when people from developed countries meet people from these developing countries, they get to have an outlook on what really happens in developing countries rather than what is being shown around in the media that might or might not be influenced. I'd like to conclude here because I think I'm taking up time.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Sanchita. Who should we have on board next? Irene Banerjee from Jadavpur, another young engineer.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here, coming here.
Thank you for not tapping the mic.
Okay, thank you. So, I have to say this a bit about something that a girl said before, that education must be available and not cheap. A very personal experience is that for studying in the premier technological institutes in India today, the cost has almost doubled and tripled, and a very personal experience would be I could not afford it. I could not afford it because it has become so high today. Globalization is the process of opening local and national boundaries to a broader perspective of an interdependent and interconnected world with the free flow of ideas, services, goods, and capital across national frontiers. International students today form a very core part of the student body of the world's leading universities. These almost 53% of the total international students, although they come from Asian countries, India, China, South Korea, but we slowly find that the number of students from the African countries is increasing greatly. So this shows that globalization has been successful in making these students realize that the existence of these world universities has helped them prepare to be at par with the level of these world universities and has actually assisted them in becoming a part of these. Another important trend would be that the shift in the student mobility patterns. Most of the students are not moving as far away from their homes as they used to a few years back. Just like he said, that 81% of the students in the universities of Japan or 75% in Korea are actually from Southeast Asian countries. This shows that globalization has led to the emancipation of education. Educational excellence is no longer limited to an elite few universities in the world, but Southeast Asian countries are being able to improve in terms of their research capacity, in terms of their learning, and they're actually being able to generate adequate amount of advertisement to gather the best minds of the world. Since my friend was mostly bordering on the negative effects, I would like to speak more on the positive effects of globalization and what are they doing to the future of universities. International campuses today are choosing very out-of-box non-traditional locations. They're moving into uncharted territory. Lancaster University has actually signed a petition in May 2009 to open a campus in Lahore, Pakistan. So these universities are explicitly designed to cater to students who might not be able to travel to Europe or America for their education. So we find that globalization has brought the focus to these countries, the students of Asia or Africa who might be deserving but might not be able to afford going to a foreign place and actually living there. Technology, globalization, they're moving hand in hand to make education much more accessible. Digitization of manuscripts, of written material, of web pages, circulation of these has made education much more available. 143 universities are providing courses free on Coursera and edX alone. Another important perspective would be that this kind of globalization and this future universities, if I can say, are actually solving much more needs than purely educational ones. We find that a very recent report of UNESCO highlights the link between between investment in postgraduate education and the economic development of the country. In Malaysia, project has been undertaken which actually aims to reduce reliance on foreign industrial research and also elevate their national economic problems. And last but not the least, I would like to say that it helps in checking the quality of education in many of the developing countries. The European Union is helping the African Union Commission to create regulatory bodies that would actually look into the quality of the higher education that is being spread across Africa. So I would say that the recent trends in globalization are actually working towards making something what we can call as a world university. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Irene. Let me ask you one question. And your department is one of the highest rated departments of engineering in Asia. And the volume of research that your department has done in the past and is doing now is also one of the best. So tell me, how many foreign students do you have in your classroom?
My department, exactly my branch, has no foreign students, but the batch senior to us has one student from Bangladesh.
So do you and your colleague from the Department of Engineering feel that maybe your student entry has to be globalized as well? Do you feel that way?
That is necessary, but the kind of limited funds that our university works under also has to be considered. A very example would be in 2005 we were given the right to, we were given the option to join the IITs, which would have given us a lot more funds, but that was not possible.
And I think that's another interesting piece of information that we all needed to know, that you have absolutely excellent departments, excellent universities and colleges. Perhaps the government in particular, because these are state-owned colleges and universities, needs to come forward and globalize the classroom. That's very often the first step. we'll just go through to our next speaker, and that will be, I guess, the other doctor. Is it Deplina or is it Tanmoy? Tanmoy? Okay.
The topic for the day is trends in globalization and the future of universities. So in order to understand this topic better, we must break this down into two distinctive parts. The first being, what are the trends in globalization that we are concerned with? And the second, in how do these trends affect the future of universities in the long run? So first up, what is globalization? Globalization is defined as the increasing interaction between number one, countries, number two, states, and number three, individuals in the form of international flow of three major things, including ideas, economy, and culture. So, based on this context, I would like to refer two very interesting quotes, one by Thomas Friedman and second by Carlos Santana. Thomas Friedman was of the opinion that no two countries, both of which have McDonald's, will ever wage war against each other. And why is that so? It's because both of them individually do have McDonald's. That is one of the effects of globalization. Secondly, Carlos Santana came up with a beautiful reference saying that one day there will be no borders, there will be no boundaries, and there will be no nationalities. And the only passport that one will ever need in any part of the world would be that of the heart. And then, moving on to trends in globalization, we must understand that globalization happens to be a very dynamic process which changes every day. And it's honestly speaking, it's dominated several realms, most notably those pertaining to population study, scientific and rational basis of information, and also it has dominated the social forefronts as well. Now, coming to the definitions and the conceptions of what a university is. A university is regarded to be an institution which preaches higher education and research, and also awards several academic degree in lieu of academic excellence in several academic disciplines. Two quotes related to universities, this time from Theodore Roosevelt, was that a man who has never gone to school might steal from a freight car. However, a person with legitimate university education might as well just steal the entire railroad. And then another quote from Bernard Shaw is that a fool's brain is going to digest philosophy as folly, science as superstition, and art as pedantry, and therefore university education is required. Now, I would like to establish a link between the essentiality of globalization in the face of university education and the future of university education as it stands in this modern day era. So I would like to state that there's always an overhanging uncertainty regarding the future of universities in the long run. We must understand that standing on the crossroads of change, universities are entrusted with a very vital and primary decision which they have to undertake for themselves, and that is whether they would amalgamate with the trends in globalization, thereby moving away from national models while simultaneously adopting, or rather imbibing, the global ideas. Okay, now before we can address that situation, we must understand, or rather resculpt, the entire definition of globalization. Globalization can't actually be defined only by economic terms and marketing considerations. Rather, as my previous speaker has spoken, it is a driving force which shall be put into place for the betterment of humankind as a whole. And therefore, we must understand that higher education is basically driven by the phenomenon of globalization, because it's creating a platform for increasing worldwide interconnectedness. And on top of that, globalization also urges students of particular universities to foster mutual relationships with students of other universities, and thereby, as a whole, it helps build global networks which can yield results in the foreseeable future. Other than that, I must throw to light the primary responsibilities that a university has, and how globalization is basically going to accentuate the entire process of educating the students of the universities regarding those primary responsibilities. The first one is that the university should ensure that the students are prepared to make a difference in this dynamic and ever-changing global context, and they can do so by developing a cosmopolitan approach. And globalization basically just encourages them to embrace these global standards. Second, a definitive problem in the higher education as of right now is insufficient infrastructure. So what does globalization do? Globalization demands that we leapfrog to newer, creative, innovative development of newer infrastructure and put them in place for the welfare of all the university students at present. And Thirdly, it encourages the full human development of the student, which reverberates and resonates with the entire ethos of the university. And through globalization, we would be more responsible towards our other fellow mates, and thereby we would learn to appreciate them regardless of barriers like nationality, race, color, or gender. So, other than that, what are the other beneficial effects that globalization brings into play? Firstly, a diversified cross-border higher educational landscape, which encourages student mobilization and also gives an opportunity for the developing countries to become the exporters of this so-called higher education. Secondly, it is going to lead to more collaboration and promotion of healthy competition in the realm of academic research. So what does globalization do? Globalization essentially elevates academic research to an international level. And once it does so, it urges collaboration amongst different nations, which can at a later point in time lead to a better yield. Also, the commencement of an international ranking system is going to promote healthy competition, which also in an indirect fashion fulfills the aforesaid objective. And therefore, in the conclusion, I would like to say that in this evolving world, academic improvement in one country doesn't necessarily mean that others should fear falling behind, because globalization indeed just acts as the trigger for all possible movement of ideas, whether be it within the university campus or beyond. So, saying that, I would like
at least our neighboring countries and qualifying to the Indian medical system. For some reason, in recent years, we've not seen so many students coming in from our neighboring countries. From Bethune, Debanjana.
Yes, globalization is a hindrance to nationalist approach, nationalist feelings of us, because somewhere down the line it actually weakens our nationalistic feeling. But university is basically a place where we should learn, and wherever we get quality education and wherever we get feasible cost, I think education should be done over there. And besides, scholarships are provided to the students, which makes the Asian students which makes it possible for the Asian students to go abroad. And I would like to address to the question which Sir rightly said, that why people are not going to Western countries nowadays and why they are opting for the Asian countries. Because as my friend rightly pointed out a few speeches before, that the Western countries, the great Western countries which are following the policy of deglobalization, the Asian countries are basically coming to rescue, because they have understood that it is for the sake of their economy that they give opportunities to the Asian people. And moreover, wherever we get more lucrative jobs, quality education at low cost, I think we would be ready to go there. Thanks a lot, sir.
Last year, in fact, we had both the University of Sydney and Boris Johnson amidst us. And this was one of the questions they faced about the treatment of Indian students and their safety when they study in overseas campuses. May I request Paul from Harvard, a very patient young man, but everything takes time. So Paul, over to you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Having listened to everyone speak, I feel the central question that we've been discussing is whether or not contemporary universities should organize their teaching philosophy around a goal of creating students who profitably fit into the current coordinates of globalization, or whether universities and schools should continue their traditional mission, which is to cultivate human potential and virtue without direct regard to the economic situation surrounding them. Organizing education to manufacture more ideal participants in globalization might even be impossible. It's important to note that there's no specific skill or aptitude that guarantees you success in the breakneck speed of the contemporary economy. Skills often lose their relevancy very quickly. For example, search engine optimization, a web development skill, was around 5 years ago thought to be perhaps the most relevant of internet skills because all web traffic was routed through search. And those fluent in it, most thought would be guaranteed employment for the rest of their lives in a growing sector, and those who advocated that education should be altered to fit globalization pointed to it as a perfect opportunity to gain some training and progress. But this turned out very poorly because, unpredictably, several years ago, social links via social media became the primary driver of web traffic, and those who specialized in search engine optimization were completely out of luck. And this really isn't just an isolated example. The current economy rapidly changes. This is what a previous speaker referred to as the changing face of globalization. It's increasingly difficult to predict which skills will be relevant 5 or 10 years down the line, given the unpredictability of the contemporary economy. It seems that economic elites choose whichever skill will best fit into their company, their investments, and then advocate its placement in universities as a required skill. And in a few years, when things have changed, the skill has changed, people are out of luck. This has happened with changes between coding languages as well. One thing this primarily demonstrates is the need for flexibility and resilience in the skills that university teaches. And one thing we have all agreed on is that debate is an excellent example of that. Globalization, as the second speaker claimed, is characterized by its speed, its constant acceleration. I'll add that speed has a paradoxical nature. The faster you move, the more slowness you see around you. The faster the economy, the more exceptions to that stand out when you're traveling around the country. Travel by horse didn't seem slow until trains were invented, which now seems slow when we have airplanes to take us from place to place. The 9-to-5 work schedule in the 1900s was an example of economic speed and development, but now it seems anachronistically out of place in an economy that requires us to be always on. This is well demonstrated by what a previous speaker mentioned. The high standards of employment leads to high standards of living, leads to high standards of education. But doesn't it keep going? High standards of education should lead to higher standards of employment. Why else do we study, of course? Advocates of globalization might point out that these concerns about speed are as ridiculous as old complaints about trains being too fast, but we seem to have gotten all of the disadvantages of globalization, but none of the benefits. In the early 1900s, many economists anticipated that economic development would let people work for 5 to 10 hours a week, and that's all, while maintaining the same standard of wealth. But people seem to be more stressed and more obligated to work the same hours. The benefits of globalization always seem just a little more speed away. When we complain that textbooks are still incredibly inaccessible, they say that, hey, things are at least a little bit better. They might be a little bit better, but the key question is whether or not they've worthed it. This has been worth it. We're building an economy that is directed towards speed, and education is very, very relevant to this process. Universities are complicit in this process. They drive it. Seeking to rescue students from tradition, schools often leave students purposeless. Education is a human activity, not an economic one, and sacrificing human thinking to the speed of the economy might leave us without a place in the world. It's increasingly difficult to understand our own meaning in a world that is dominated by economic time and not human time, not biographical time in which we can find our meaning and find stability. There are some positives in globalization, to be sure, but we need to produce students who don't merely fit into globalization, into the globalized economy. Instead, we need to produce students who don't fit into it, who question the current direction of globalization and what's happening, in order not to move back from globalization in a regressive manner, but instead to move beyond it further. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. That's a very interesting perspective, that you need students who don't actually fit in. You need students to keep on asking questions, and I'm sure your teachers, I don't know what your teachers would think about that. I thought they were the one who were asking the questions and they expect you to memorize. Well, the final speaker for this morning, and my colleague in CDC, Mayuri Mukherjee, she would have actually been conducting this session along with me had she not enlisted herself as a speaker. So Mayuri, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Even though our visitors couldn't name an Indian brand, I'm sure they've heard of brand tandoori chicken. Yeah, and if you order that, it'll taste as good as it does if you order it here. It'll probably be more hygienic. And if that's not a global village, what is? I think what's been discussed today primarily, along with the good parts of globalization, we have also discussed its dark side. by which I think the growth of the markets don't really reflect on the socio-economic growth, or the flow of capital and globalization isn't really symmetrical, which means we leave a huge section of us behind when we're globalized. And I think that's who we should focus on primarily, because if you look at the second part of the argument of the theme today about the focus on universities, and I think two big questions that came from our visitors are the question of scholarships and how much they can benefit us, and also the cost of education in general. So here's a fact that might make you cry. For the 3-year undergrad program we have, the total cost is less than £100 at presidency. So it's not that we don't have enough measures in place for our IITs. Yes, we do have a higher course fee that's increasing, but once you get in, you have a lot of scholarships that make studying easier. So the problem is, how do you get in? Or even when you talk about a scholarship, how do you get the scholarship? So what we generally tend to see is that people who apply for these scholarships are also not on an equal plane. For example, the people competing with me to get a scholarship, they aren't, possibly maybe because of the college they study in or the kind of economic background they come from, unfortunately, it does really determine the kind of agency they have to get access to a scholarship. So while it's great that scholarships are a means of furthering growth or participation or cultural globalization, if you will, I think the accessibility to the scholarship is also something that should be determined by the kind of university structure that we have in place, which seeks to at least provide somewhat equal footing to everybody who even wants to apply for a scholarship. Apart from that, I think, so the other question was about the funds, what we require to study. Same thing, right? So if you would like to come to presidency or to a great engineering college or to a great medical college, it necessarily means that you would have to go to a good school where you could afford to pay good tuition, could afford to go to another extra center outside your school to make sure you could train for these really competitive entrance exam processes. And I think that's one of the biggest problems I have with the darker sides of globalization, which is how it's commodified education, essentially. This insane rush to get into the best college, which means that there's a lot of pressure on the college to also build a brand value as to how good it is and how much it can show. And I think what this does is just seek to, while I understand that international participation is great foreign policy, you get a lot of investment from foreign places, but so what happens is the dominance of culture that was also mentioned. I think when we have, so a very interesting debate a few days ago was, why do we not have enough teachers who teach Sanskrit in our colleges? Why are regional languages dying out? And to answer that question, the answer was that we don't have students who want to study, so what will the teachers really do? So while I understand that foreign investment and foreign influence is very essential to how a university grows, I also get why some people would be protectionist about their culture. I also get why they would want to protect certain languages from being dominated. But at the end of it, I think it's great that globalization has made us closer in terms of access to what we can read and what we can learn and people we can interact with. I think when one of the most interesting stories that I feel, which came to a very fitting conclusion this year itself, is so when Marquez died in 2014, the University of Texas system is who brought all his old diaries and all his manuscripts. There was an auction and they managed to privately buy all of it, and there's a very prominent newspaper here. I'm not looking back to see if they're one of our sponsors, but I'm not going to take the risk of mentioning their names. So they're known for their very sensational headlines, and I hope you don't write for them. Okay. And they said that the death of a socialist is in the hands of a capitalist. And there was so much furor over, who was buying his books. But this year they actually digitized his entire collection, all his work, and released it for free for everybody to access. So I do understand. So, I mean, the entire world can now read. More people can access it than what would have been possible if it had been restricted to a community. So while I do understand the good parts of globalization, I also think that we strive for equality, and that's what globalization should do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayuri. Before we wrap up this session, Professor Littlefield, would you like to say something?
From our university in particular, the global population is huge. On our campus alone, there is a large building labeled Global University of Central Florida in trying to make the international students feel more involved and feel as though they have a distinct place in campus. And I think this has allowed us to understand the necessity of understanding that comes with globalization, whether it be the educational aspects that you get through websites and free information being accessed, or just the interactions that are allowed on campuses. Many people are forgetting that universities are their own location. They are a unique part of people's lives that not only let them learn, everyone can pick up books, and books can be made accessible, but if there's no interaction with this knowledge, interaction with other people and cultures, you're never gaining the knowledge and the experience that you need. And I think that's the true emphasis of why we need to understand the future of universities, not just the short term as to what it implies for the next election or the next capitalistic concept, the next economic movement, but rather understanding how these cultures, these people interacting is necessary for us to move forward, us to allow ourselves to be more progressive in understanding each other and sharing how these ideas interact with each other. Uniquely, it's not just the education, but the space, understanding how interacting with each other is going to be most necessary in the long term when our borders, as the Carlos Santana quote very clearly emphasizes, understanding that borders are something we should be trying to understand better, not just something we take on face value we need to be divided by, but rather understanding what they mean for us, what it means to have distinct cultures and still interact with each other regardless, and know that those distinct cultures not only separate us, but may bring us closest.
Oh, thank you. That was lovely. Absolutely lovely. We have amongst us a CDC debater from 2015 who's actually researching globalization. Although his research subject, if I understand correctly, is globalization in politics. So I'll request Sharan Banerjee.
I am technically a byproduct of globalization because I studied over here in presidency. I did my undergrad in economics. Now I'm in Sciences Po, the Paris School of International Affairs, doing my master's in international economic policy. I think as for the past 1 year when I researched globalization, I think the most important thing that I've realized is the fact that it's not about economic flows, it's not about migration, it's about this idea of a global consciousness, and it's about a global identity. And as Samuel Huntington put it in his famous book, Clash of Civilizations, it's basically about two civilizations or two concepts of civilizations, sparring with each other at different points of time. To think of globalization when I look at these issues, I think the first thing that I realize is the fact that when you're looking at people moving from the third world or the developing countries to the developed countries, you realize the fact that because of the fact that the number of people who are moving are much greater than what the politics or the policy of the developed countries allows, there is this idea of identities that gets diluted. Now, when this idea of an identity gets diluted, for instance, what is British anymore at this point of time, or what is French anymore at this point of time, if you're looking at the outskirts or the suburbs of Paris, which looks like cities in Turkey or Baghdad, right? So you understand one thing is that when these identities get diluted, there is a backlash that happens. There is a cultural backlash that comes in. And when this cultural backlash comes in, the universities also become an important role or become very, very important aspects of the policy, because universities cannot operate on themselves. All this talk about, creating textbooks and, creating a curriculum, it's all a subset of the policy. Now, if the government decides that you are going to scrap off H-1B visas for a certain country, or you're going to restrict migration from one country or the other, as much as universities may want, or as much as universities may want to create MOOCs or anything like that, the basic idea of the fact that identities are clashing, and because of this clash of identities, you're not having a truly international audience. Your labor markets are not working in the same way, which is why a lot of students are not going to succeed in these foreign universities, even though they may have an international curriculum, but they are going to be forced back into their own countries because your employers don't want you because of racial bias, because of identity bias, because of xenophobia, and so many other things. The trends in globalization today are definitely not in sync with what the trends in an idealistic university education should be like. So I think the focus at a primary level should be looking at what we can do beyond the university, what the university can do beyond its space, to look at how this issue of identity clashes, to look at this, as I say, clash of civilizations. How this clash of civilizations can, protect the people who are moving, and how you can look, and how universities can look at creating a space where identities coexist rather than identities being parasites on each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Just leave the mic. Thank you. Professor Littlefield, would you like to speak for a couple of minutes? Professor Robert Littlefield from the University of Central Florida. May we have a round of applause?
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today, our students and faculty, to join with you. This is a unique opportunity for you to come together from all of your different institutions and to share your ideas. And that's really at the heart of the debate tradition. I think when this video or whatever is being produced here is transmitted over YouTube or on the internet, that we may see the full effect of the globalization. I believe as a teacher and as a debate coach that as I listened today, some of the things I noticed that I thought were effective practices would include that you were presenting your claims and then you were providing the warrant and the evidence for making sense of things. And I think that's a skill that people in our society do not always demonstrate, that they make claims without using evidence. They make claims without explaining the warrants or the circumstance that helps their argument make sense. So I encourage you to continue to do that, to strive to do that. Globalization exposes cultural groups to new perspectives in its very basic format. When globalization occurs, when we have the extension of ideas into an area, it promotes that brand or that perspective, and it changes things. And I think that in terms of the future of universities, the use of technology and its effects is going to have a dramatic impact on how universities deliver knowledge. And I think that the globalization is changing how knowledge is transferred and how we are able to provide a greater awareness. Access is not restricted by geography when we use technology.
Thank you, Professor Littlefield. That was really very heartening, especially for our young students here from the various colleges in Kolkata, for your very kind comments. So one of the things that globalized education taught us was to take a pen and a paper and to write. And that's how globalization has embraced our education system. Now with technology, I'm sure we are going in another direction. The age of paper is coming to an end all over the world, and it's coming to an end in India as well. It's been a really wonderful morning. Calcutta Debating Circle is very grateful to all the participating colleges for joining in today, and particularly to the host institution, Presidency University.